Alright, you want the entire history of World War II? Here it is. Strap yourselves in because this is gonna be a bumpy ride. Alright, so before we get into World War II, we have to talk about World War I first. See, the late 1800s was basically just one giant party for the European powers. They were all out here flexing their newfound industrial power with massive armies and aggressive foreign policies. It was awesome. But then they ruined it when they started fighting over who got to flex the most. So there's two main sides here. On the one hand, you had the Triple Entente, which is France, Russia, and Great Britain. And then on the other side, you had the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. But obviously this conflict isn't called the Triple Entente vs. the Triple Alliance War. It's called World War. So clearly this is way more complicated than just two groups of countries not liking each other. See, the catalyst for the war was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. Long story short, some random kid shot him, and that was enough to push Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia. Why? Well, Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination. But really, they also wanted an excuse to crack down on their own rebellious subjects. The Serbians had already been stirring up some trouble by promoting Serbian nationalism in Austria-Hungary's Slavic territories, especially after the Russians made it clear that they would support Serbia if something were to happen to them. So, when the assassination happened, Austria-Hungary jumped on the chance to put down this rebellion once and for all. So after declaring war on Serbia, Austria-Hungary started marching through the Balkans towards Belgrade. Not long after, the Russians jumped into action to defend Serbia because, remember, they promised they would. This led to Germany supporting Austria unconditionally and began to mobilize its troops. And that caused the French to do the same thing. And thus, within weeks, all of Europe was at war. Now, don't ask me how everyone managed to pick sides so quickly. I have no idea. Just roll with it. But now that the fighting began, who do you think won? Well, not the Belgians, that's for sure. See, the Germans began their invasion of Belgium on their way to France. But unlike what the Germans expected, the Belgians put up a fierce fight, inflicting heavy casualties on the German troops. This caused the Germans to get pissed off and start using their newfound firepower on the civilian population, killing hundreds of innocent people. So yeah, the Germans didn't win. But neither did anyone else because this was by far the deadliest war that humanity had ever seen. And it wasn't just the new firepower that made it so deadly. No, you see, this was the first war where the major powers could sustain their war efforts almost indefinitely. You see, before World War I, wars in Europe were usually pretty short affairs because the countries involved could keep up with their expenses for very long. But now that Europe had industrialized, these countries could basically print as much money as they needed, which meant they could raise massive armies and keep them supplied with weapons and food for as long as they needed. In fact, during World War I, there were more men mobilized for combat than the entire population of France. So with all these resources, it seemed like the war would never end. In fact, it seemed like the French and the British might actually lose the war until the United States decided to join the fight. You see, even though the US was still kind of neutral, they were shipping tons of supplies to the British and the French anyway. And this irritated the Germans, who began attacking ships carrying American goods to Britain. And the last straw came when a German U-boat sank a ship carrying 128 US passengers. So President Woodrow Wilson finally declared war on Germany and threw the full weight of the American industrial machine behind the Allies. This turned the tide of the war and the Allies began pushing back the Germans. But then the Spanish flu hit and everything just went to hell. Now, to be fair, the pandemic did cause the war to drag on any longer because the war ended before the pandemic even peaked. But the pandemic did kill millions of soldiers and civilians and made the war even more brutal than it already was. And yes, it was already really brutal before the pandemic. For example, there were poison gas attacks, tanks, and aircraft. But eventually the fighting did stop and the Treaty of Versailles was signed, ending World War I, and it was truly one of the most humiliating defeats in German history. I mean, the Germans had to admit that they were solely responsible for starting the war, had to give up all of their overseas colonies, had to demilitarize their army and navy, and then on top of all of that, they also had to pay for all the damages they caused. Talk about rubbing salt in the wound. But why am I telling you all of this? Well, to understand how World War II started, you have to understand the aftermath of World War I. See? After World War I, Europe was super pissed at Germany. I mean, they had every right to be mad, but that doesn't change the fact that they were mad. So, to make sure that Germany would never start another war, the European powers formed the League of Nations to act as a governing body for international relations. But the problem was that the United States refused to sign the treaty establishing the League, which meant that the whole thing was toothless. And that became very apparent when Japan decided to invade Manchuria in 1931, but the League of Nations did try to intervene, but they didn't have the power to back up their threats. So Japan kept on doing whatever they wanted, and this emboldened the Italians to invade Ethiopia in 1935. Again, the League tried to intervene, but they failed yet again. And that was when Hitler decided that he was done playing nice. See, Hitler had already been taking small steps towards rearming Germany and beginning territorial expansion. But the Italian invasion of Ethiopia was the final straw. Hitler was ready to go to war. First, he began rearming the Rhineland, which the Treaty of Versailles explicitly forbade. But since no one did anything about it, he continued on. He then annexed Austria in 1938, and then the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. And once again, he was met with basically no resistance. And that was when the Brits and the French finally decided that they had enough and told Hitler that they would unallow him to take any more territory. But Hitler just invaded Poland anyway, and thus World War II had begun. Now, just like in World War I, this conflict doesn't have a neat explanation. There are too many variables here. But the basic idea is that Germany and their allies, which now included Italy and Japan, were tired of being humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles and wanted to build their empires. Meanwhile, the allies, which now included the United States, were determined to prevent Germany from ever threatening world peace again. Now, early on, it seemed like Germany would easily conquer Poland, just like they did in World War I, but then the Soviet Union jumped in and took half of Poland for themselves. And then the Finns also jumped in and started harassing the Soviets, which forced them to focus their attention elsewhere. Then the French and the British also jumped in and managed to hold off the Germans for quite some time. But eventually the Germans broke through and began marching across Europe. Meanwhile, in Asia, the Japanese were also expanding their empire, taking control of large swaths of Southeast Asia, but the Americans stopped them short at the Battle of Midway. But the Germans weren't so lucky. They kept on getting pushed back until they were finally cornered in Berlin. In the end, the Germans lost the war for several reasons. First of all, they were fighting on multiple fronts, which stretched their resources way too thin. Secondly, the vast majority of the German people were completely against the war, which drained their economy and manpower. And finally, the Allies simply had more resources than the Germans. At the end of the day, the combined industrial output of the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China was greater than that of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. However, the Allies did suffer heavy casualties throughout the war. I mean, the Soviet Union lost over 20 million people, which was more than the entirety of the Polish population. But in the end, they triumphed, and the Germans surrendered on May 8, 1945, but the fighting didn't stop there. You see, while the Allies were crushing the Germans, the Americans were also fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, and those fights were extremely brutal. For example, there was the attack on Pearl Harbor, the firebombing of Tokyo, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But nonetheless, the Japanese fought to the bitter end, which resulted in over 2 million Japanese casualties. In the end, the Americans occupied Japan and set up a government friendly to the U.S., and that officially ended World War II on September 2, 1945, so there you go. That was the entire history of World War I and World War II in under 6 minutes. I know you probably wondering how I managed to condense 2 of the deadliest conflicts in human history into less than 6 minutes, but I simply cut out all the fluff. If you don't believe me, watch this again and count all the names I dropped. Also, if you made it this far, I assume you love history.